So, my name's Jake. I'll get into sort of what I've been doing over the last sort of 18 months pretty soon. I'll let a few people grab a seat, but what I want to talk to you today about is something that I haven't seen too many talks on. We often always see talks at conferences about a certain technology and why this technology is awesome and the reasons you should adopt it. But very seldom do I see anyone talking about what are the impacts when we choose one of these technologies. How does it affect our team, the motivation, our ability to hire, a bunch of these other things around the technology. My name's Jake. You can hit me up on Twitter. That's my GitHub. And I work for a media company in Australia called 7 West Media. So they've got a Channel 7, which is owns a lot of shows like Home and Away and a bunch of others. Quite a large news station. And specifically, I work in the newspaper company of the group, which is WA News. So WA News released the first newspaper in WA in 1833. That was about 4 years after Perth in Australia, where I'm from, was actually named. A little bit of interesting history is my great-great-great-granddad was the first colonial secretary, so he's got quite a few notices on this first edition of the Perth Gazette. Quite a few years later, that paper got renamed to the West Australian newspaper, which is the name of the newspaper today. Our team was built in a very short amount of time. So previous to when my team was created about 18 months ago, the West Australian had actually outsourced their entire digital strategy. So just a crappy little website through to a partnership with Yahoo, where Yahoo actually was providing the entire news platform for WA News. Our team was created to bring all of that in-house and actually take control of the digital future of this company. What I'm going to chat to you about is a bunch of the technologies and decisions that we've taken along the last 18 months and the way that's actually affected our team and various other soft sort of edges around a technology. So we decided that we'd build this team and co-locate it on the newsroom floor. So this little area here is where our team is set up. We've got about 20 to 25 people, including product managers, designers, developers, and such. And then where all those TVs are, that's called the super desk. So that's where they actually put the newspaper together. They work to a 5 p.m. deadline every day, and the cadence is daily because all the journos come in and they've got to build a newspaper from scratch every day. That's provided some really interesting challenges because this whole organization is built around this newsroom and building this newspaper every day. So our team, when we were building it up, had a couple of goals. First, to create this new digital platform. So new website and also sort of mobile apps, want it to be responsive to supplement the existing newspaper because print media, while it's still a very strong industry, obviously digital is becoming huge. People spend so much time on their phones, and unless you're playing in that space, it's just not going to work as a company. So the main decisions that I want to cover today are what did we actually build the website on? The choice of CMS and kind of the entire tech stack. We could have gone with pre-made products and customized them, build it from scratch, those sort of things. We also chose to put a design system in place, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what a design system is and why you might want to consider using them. When we built the mobile app, we started building it in native code, just native Swift, and then ended up switching it over to React Native a bit later. Why did we do that? What were some of the side effects of that? We also switched from SAS in our initial product launch, which was the West. Later on, we relaunched Perth Now, which is another news site. We actually switched over our styling approaches. Had some really interesting side effects that I didn't really see coming. And finally, one of our current sort of endeavors is to move towards continuous deployment. We kind of were trying to achieve continuous delivery, and that was working reasonably well for us, but we want to try and push a little bit further. So there's a heap of technology choices and concepts that I'm going to cover, but then get into all of the sort of reasoning behind it and the impacts around the team. If anyone has any questions as I go, feel free to throw your hand up and we can answer them as we go. So the first thing we wanted to do is really build our core team values. What are we going to anchor all of our decisions around? And I highly recommend actually sort of building a team charter or deciding what your team values are, because it impacts all of the decisions you're going to be making. And you often don't realize how many decisions are being made. I called out some really big and obvious ones for our team, but there's so many decisions you make, and often many non-decisions that you didn't even consider as really a decision. So we wanted to build our team around the community. Perth has a really good meetup community that is supportive. We've got a bunch of really cool local conferences, which is surprising in such a small city. We wanted to build cross-functional teams. We didn't really want to segregate by sort of back end and front end. We wanted to have an adaptable team because of the cadence of the business, they're thinking maybe 24 hours in advance. This is very different to many of the other companies I've worked in. So my background previously was working for a consulting company called Redify, and they're mainly a .NET consulting company, so I'd go in and help different companies out. Most companies have a larger cadence. They're working to a 6, 12, 18 months, 2-year plan. So most of the time, you're able to work in these sort of, you don't have to worry about the business thinking too quickly and changing their mind all the time. But because of that really fast cadence of the newspaper, we needed the team to be really adaptable to be able to just handle all these curveballs that are thrown to us the whole time. We wanted to give autonomy over decisions. So joining WA News was really interesting coming from consulting, because often we're trying to encourage the executives to say, give your team autonomy, let them make their own decisions, give them the power to help you succeed. We got given that. So we were allowed to choose whatever technologies we wanted, and our mandate was pretty much to succeed, just get this site relaunched. And there were a number of commercial timings, which everyone hates fixed deadlines, but these were kind of the realities of us joining the team. The business needed to get some stuff done in a certain time. So to do that, we needed to be able to make the decisions and not be impeded by sort of the executive staff saying, no, you can't choose this technology because of no valid reason. And then the main one is don't impact the existing newsroom. Like, until we actually have a digital strategy in place, the paper is going to continue being a core part of this business. We need to support the journos and allow them to sort of take their craft and bring it online. So they were kind of our main team values that we wanted to sort of anchor all of our decisions around. So as I said, we had a deadline. Our team was kind of started to be built with about 6 months or so from when the product had to be relaunched. So that's all of the back end, the front end, the tools that the journos will actually use to curate content, put it on the front page. And if anyone has built a team before, you should know that it's actually a really difficult proposition to build a team from scratch. You've got to find people, interview them, and there's also a huge risk. When you pull a whole lot of people together, you can end up with awful team culture. People don't work together, they're not aligned in their values, and there's a lot of other problems that can come up. So we had to build a team really quickly. I came on probably about halfway through this process, with about 3.5 months before having to launch the website. At that point, had most of the team, and probably had been working for about 2 to 3 weeks on actually writing code for this platform. The things a news site actually needs to run is the journos have to be able to create the content, obviously, that's going to go on the page. Then nearly every news site is manually curated. So the stuff you see on the front page is actually curated by journos. It's not just the latest news coming in. The journalists are actually looking at what's the most relevant, choosing and manually curating that page to make sure that you don't want to leave it to chance that these two news stories that might, if you read them next to each other, those two headlines kind of can play off against each other in really bad ways. These are things that the journos are constantly thinking about. So they have to curate the content on the main sort of homepage. And then finally, we have to actually render the site, and people have to visit the site and read it and all of those sort of things. Our company is also based, it's an advertising-based company, so like most news sites, all of the company's revenue comes from advertising, so we needed to keep that in mind. The journalists actually use a product from a company in Europe called CCI, and they use a product called Newsgate. So this is the tool that all the journos build all their stories up, and they actually put the newspaper together. So we decided that we would use Node and React, and we would let them author the content in this existing news platform, and then we would allow them to publish it onto our website. So we didn't want to choose one of the sort of main existing CMSs, because most of those come with their own content curation, page management, a whole bunch of concepts that we didn't want to have to put onto our journos. Remember, team values in terms of what we want to anchor our decisions around, we didn't want to impact the existing business. So all of these would have been quite disruptive to the existing business. So we decided, let's go bespoke and build this platform, front-end platforms from scratch, but we don't need to rebuild the content authoring because we have Newsgate. So there are a few real things that I haven't touched on that fed into this decision that I found quite interesting. By the time I joined, the decision to build on React and use Node was already made, and that was one of the reasons I joined. I was really, really interested in that technology, and I wanted to use it day to day. Being a consultant, you just have to use whatever your clients are using, and I really wanted to get better at React and do that full time. So this was a really interesting opportunity for me. I got to use React full time. I had power over the decisions that were being made. It was the first time that I'd moved into a management position. So my role there is actually the development manager. So I'm responsible for the development team and their sort of happiness. So love the idea and the opportunities. We get to actually rebuild a news stack from scratch. Being so late to the game, you can have a look at all of these companies around the world, see what they've done, and use all of their failures and kind of learn from it, which is really exciting. So the first thing I talked about is we wanted to build our team out of the community, and that's what we did. But one of the problems with building a team out of the community is people have really cool jobs already. So this is one of the main reasons we went with React. It's not so much that technology was great and that we really believed in it, is that Perth is quite strongly aligned to .NET. And because of that, the main JavaScript framework is Angular. There was a heap of really strong and interesting Angular projects across Perth, but there was next to no projects on React. So by choosing React as our technology, we had a huge draw card for people who were interested in the technology and they wanted to throw themselves at it. It was one of the main reasons that I moved. So that allowed us to really get a couple of cool and interesting people from the community that were super motivated. And that helped us build this team really rapidly. So yeah, Angular was very popular. We ended up going with React just because it's different, and we thought that the technology was really promising and that it would help us achieve what we wanted to achieve. Also, because we had the opportunity to look at all these other companies, I had been looking at what the New York Times had been doing even before I got into media, because they'd been building their bespoke news platform out and rebuilt it a couple of times. And around this time, they'd just started rebuilding their entire news platform on React as well. They're also really strongly aligned with the community. They had a GitHub organization up and they were releasing the bits of their internal tools and the way they were solving problems. So having such a large and reputable news company going down this road was a really good signal for us. So what were some of the main learnings I took out of this? Because there were so many roads that we could have taken, and we ended up going down a particular path. The first one is ad tech and analytics does not work very well with single page applications. Who here uses an ad blocker out of interest? Yeah. So if you don't, you realize how awful advertising technology is. Going from line of business applications, this is the first time I'd actually really touched ad tech, and also I used an ad blocker as well. So I never saw most of it. It's been really interesting actually having to integrate with all of these analytics frameworks and whatnot. Most of them, we had to do a bunch of hacks around, especially some of the analytics and sort of industry measurement tools that are out there that you have to use on your site. Otherwise, you just don't end up in these different rating programs that directly affect how much money you get paid for putting advertising on your site. We had a huge amount of problems integrating all of this ad tech because it was built for times when you just had simple server request response, not single page applications. So ads, they pop out, you can't constrain them to their little iframes because they do all this silly stuff. They want to be able to track users and do all of that sort of stuff. So originally locked it down and tried to really restrict this kind of analytics and really respect our users. We're still very strong on that and want to continue pushing into that area, but the technology really impeded us. There's some good signs out there though, because Google is now doing a bunch of initiatives around advertising tech in terms of making sure that if your site is doing including bad ads that give a poor user experience, they'll actually start ranking you down, which is kind of cool because the users are finally starting to be put back in the forefront. React has been a really good choice for us just in terms of the technology's been really good, fun to use, but it's continued to attract people to our team. We've had a few people drop in from overseas. They were sort of going to be in Perth for 6 to 9 months. They could join our team, give us a heap of contributions and then head home. It's been really good having, just being able to use React in this way. I didn't realize how much a technology can impact the type of people you get and their level of interest and enthusiasm. Because we did a single page application, we had to resolve many problems. So with analytics, we want to be able to sort of include the length of an article, what the author is, all of these sort of things, which if you're using traditional request response style pages, that's super easy. Like all of the DOM events exist to do all of that stuff. With single page applications, you have to kind of reinvent page life cycles. You have problems around scroll restoration. Luckily, new modern browsers have specs for that, so it's all solved. But in IE and whatnot, you have to sort of manually manipulate the scroll depth of the page when you're navigating between, like jump back up to the top and all of those sort of things. It's a little bit of a pain. Something that's been really cool is previously, coming from a .NET background, we'd have .NET on the server using MVC or one of these sort of server-side technologies, and then we'd have JavaScript on the client. That had a bunch of issues, like where do we store our validation logic? Do we put it in the front end? Do we put it in the back end? Most of the time the correct answer is put it in both. Having JavaScript everywhere, both on the client and the server, has meant that our team, we could actually achieve the cross-functional aspect of our team much better than if we had two different technologies, because we can cycle people around. We're lucky that we have a team of people who actually really like learning and like trying out all of these different areas, and we've removed programming language as a barrier there. So that's been something that has been a really good boon for us. That leads me to the next decision. I'm going to kind of leave the first CMS choice behind, which was probably the largest decision. It underpins everything. A much smaller and subtle one is introducing the concept of a design system. Who's heard of this? Not too many people. So the idea of a design system over just a component library is you can bring your patterns, your fonts, the way you solve problems in terms of user experience, putting all of those together. So one of the best design systems I've seen is from Salesforce. They actually publish it online. You can go and view it. But Microsoft also has recently rebuilt Outlook.com, and they've re-released their component library and their design system. So a design system is kind of a superset of your component library. And the focus of it is to capture kind of the way your team and your business solve particular user experience problems. So we have a standard way of, like all of our font sizes, we have a standard way of doing form inputs, we have a standard way of spacing out all of our different components, so we have a nice vertical rhythm across all of our pages. The decision was made very early that we would try and build a design system and try and capture all of that sort of greater than a component library information. So there's a few different goals. This is the side that I had previously been using, sort of build a component library, a bunch of reusable components to help us move faster. The goals around the component library is reusability. You want a component to be reusable in a bunch of different contexts. You kind of want styling to be included by default. So if you're in React or even Angular land, you've kind of got Bootstrap and Material UI as these kind of component libraries that you can pull in that give you a bunch of styled components by default, kind of get you running. And a component library is mainly built for the developers in your team. If you go across to the design language, focuses a lot more on the business and the greater impact to the team. So focus on your domain-specific language. Don't use terms for the development team, use terms for the entire business. Components in the design system don't have to be reusable. That was kind of a really interesting point for me. In one of our products, Perth Now, we have a number of different headers up the top. Each area is like we have news, sport, entertainment. Each of those has a certain color associated with it, that color is reflected in that entire sort of subsection of the site. Before this approach, I would imagine that those sort of colors would exist in the product because that's kind of makes sense to me. No other product would be reusing those colors because it's so specific. Instead, with the design system, all of that is moved into our design system, is documented. So when you go into it, you can see blue is the news color, and this is the way we use that blue across all of the different areas of the site. It has a huge focus on underlying consistency across everything. So in a component library, you kind of focus on the reusable nature of that component. Design system will focus on, okay, how do you use typography in each of these components? So these two different components that are doing very different things use typography in the same way. This sort of leads it to be a much more focus on the business and the needs of the greater team. So the designers, the product managers, they all use the design system in their decision making. One of the side effects that's been really interesting is bringing developers and designers together, because it gives you a medium that you can actually collaborate over. Normally the design tools are quite different to the development tools. Designers sort of live in Sketch in our world, and developers kind of live in VS Code. This allows us to collaborate over the design system. The way I used to build things, which I think I still tend to do, is I really enjoy building things in a product and then build it again in another product. And this is probably my consultant experience talking. So build it in a product, build it in another product, finally build it in somewhere that's reusable. So like a component library or an open source product, resolve the problem for the third time, and then replace by implementation in the other products. The person that sort of gave me this idea, and I've followed around, is Jimmy Bogart, who's also here. He's responsible for AutoMapper. But that's the way AutoMapper and Mediator and a bunch of his open source projects have been created. He solved that problem over and over at different clients, and then finally created a reusable approach and installed it everywhere. So that's kind of the component library and the way I used to kind of see building things. The design system thinking has really changed the way I approach these problems. So it's kind of think about the problem that I'm trying to solve. Where does it fit? What other components do we have that solve a similar problem? Could we actually solve it in a way that is more consistent with the way we've solved similar problems across our products? If it's a new problem and it actually deserves a new solution in the design system, then build the simplest thing that allows you to solve that problem. And then finally, consume it in the products. The goals and impacts of these two different approaches are really subtle, and I've had a hard time trying to put together the way to explain this. The other interesting thing is having a design system does not stop you using components. Like React is a very component-orientated model. It doesn't stop you from being using this model. So imagine this outside dark blue is a design system component. It's something that business knows about. Could be like a public article page or something like that. It's a high-level, tangible thing that the business understand. Internally, we'll decompose that into a bunch of reusable modules. And these lower level modules might be reused across multiple design system components. So you've got this kind of overall large building blocks of ways you solve problems, and then a bunch of little component library components that feed in that help you achieve both speed of development and reusability, but also consistency across products. One of the side effects though, and going back to one of our initial goals, was building cross-functional teams. So when you introduce a component library or any sort of framework or anything within your team, it introduces friction because something has to be built in that and then consumed in the product. And there's this constant temptation to go, well, why don't we just write stories which are build X product in or X component in the component library or the design system? Then another story, and I'm talking about sort of Scrum, Agile level stories here, user stories. Another story which is consume it in the product. That then gets taken one step further, which is, okay, why don't we just create a component team and then a product team, and they can just solve each of these problems. That creates a huge divide in your team, and it was something that we wanted to actively strive against because we wanted to build cross-functional teams. So we've worked pretty hard to make sure that we keep the cross-functional team and stopped that divide happening, but it's something that just naturally occurs as soon as you have separation of code bases and building something somewhere else and then consuming it. You just have that natural temptation to try and separate those two problems. And it's been quite an interesting side effect. This causes a little bit of friction because we tend to build a component. We then have to put up a pull request because we're using Git. We can then publish a pre-release version of that component library, then consume it in a product, then realize we've got problems and go through that. You can link things up locally to make it a little bit easier, but separating those two things does introduce workflow issues. That is another thing we've had to work pretty hard to make sure the developer experience is not impacted due to this decision. So what are the learnings from this one? Make sure that you've got a shared understanding of the goals of a decision. When we introduced the idea of a design system, we brought new people onto the team and didn't really explain why the design system was there. This led to a number of misunderstandings. When I started, just not understanding the reason for a design system. So my tendency to go build stuff in a product and not put it in the reusable spot because it's not reusable, it felt very unnatural for me. So now try and make sure that everyone has a really good shared understanding of the reason we're doing some things. These decisions are not made just because. We actually have a reason for trying to do some of these things. I have a much greater appreciation for front-end development. Before, I would just kind of grab Bootstrap or something. I'll kind of come back to the design side of things. And didn't really have a great appreciation for how difficult building an entire site is with consistent design without one of these CSS frameworks. It requires its own thinking and architecture and modeling and that sort of thing. So that's where the design system has come in. It's actually given us that framework to do sort of front-end level architecture, as well as we have the whole systems architecture as well. Very different problem. That's been really interesting for me. Also, a number of times we just built something in the product and didn't actually plan it out. One of the side effects I found really interesting is the times that we've hit a new problem, properly planned it out, documented the way it would work in business terminology, and then solved the technical problems, we've ended up with a much better result. Sometimes, like advertising, our team had very little experience in advertising, so we just built it in the product and kind of experimented, which is cool. Like, it's a great way to learn, but 6 months, 12 months down the track, realized we've got some fundamental sort of issues in the way we've implemented it, which is slowing us down. We've invested in good testing tools in our component library and our design system. So one of the best things I was showing a few of the people in my workshop yesterday was visual regression testing. So if you've got any sort of component library, highly recommend looking into visual regression testing. We have all of our React components, and in a test, we can just say, I want a visual snapshot of this. Has anyone used snapshot testing before? Heard of it? So the idea of snapshot testing is, rather than in your tests doing an assertion which is expect some value to be another value, you just say expect whatever, it's an object, it's an image, to match this snapshot. That will write that result to disk and you check it in as part of your Git commit. Then someone else checks out that code. When the test runs, it checks the value it's being passed with the value that's been saved to disk. So it's like a gold copy of what the expected result is. The cool thing is about that is it captures additional things that have been added as well as just the things you're asserting. So takeaway from this talk is in terms of practical things rather than just things to consider. Have a look at snapshot testing. It's changed the way I do testing. So we did visual regression testing, which allows us to do a snapshot visually of a component. So we render it in Chrome and take a screenshot. That image gets dropped onto disk. So if a component changes, we get an image, which is the old image, stitched to the new image, and then a diff, image diff. So it highlights all of the differences in purple. That's been amazing, especially when we've got a component that is composed of 30, 40 other little components. We can see when there's bad interactions visually. Been such a good investment. Document decisions. I can't stress this one enough. We had made so many decisions as we went early in the team, and we'd just do a little huddle and then, yep, cool, that's good, and then go. It would have been so valuable if we just wrote those down in a decision log. Highly recommend creating a decision log, and every time you have one of these discussions about should we do it this way or this way, only takes 5 minutes. Just document it. It's so useful when new members of the team come on board and they're like, why is this done this way? Highly, highly recommend it because you can revisit any of those conversations, but it is, if you don't have sort of the history, makes it really hard to start that conversation. The next main decision I wanted to talk about was our introduction of React Native to our mobile app. I'm not going to spend too long on this one, but there was a few outcomes that were super interesting. So after the West was launched, we had a really short runway. We wanted to launch the mobile app for the West. We had a single mobile developer who was writing the iOS version in Swift. We kind of were thinking about, well, if we write it in React Native, we can have different members of the team who already know React, they know JavaScript, we'll have a lot more in common. So hopefully we can improve collaboration and there won't be the mobile guy off to the side and then the rest of the development team. So having that sort of divide of the two technologies kind of didn't make it feel like a combined development team. So we decided, let's give React Native a go. In fact, I wanted to allow a mobile developer to make that decision because at the end of the day, we want autonomy over our decisions, and by imposing a technology choice on someone, that kind of sucks. It takes control of their own sort of job away from them. So they got a bit of time to experiment with it, learn the technology, and then choose to go down that road, which was pretty interesting. Once again, deadlines kind of hit, and we made the fundamental mistake of let's throw people at the problem. So what ended up happening is a whole bunch of the rest of the team came in and kind of kicked the existing developer off to the side and kind of it's really hard to build shared understanding in a really short space of time. So it just made our developer who had built a bunch of stuff out feel like his work wasn't that much appreciated. So there were some really interesting learnings just from my point of view in terms of first time I managed a team, could have prevented this, could have done this in a better way. But the main takeaways for the React Native choice for me was having multiple platforms. We decided to launch Android sort of halfway through. There is no way we would have been able to build up an Android version of this app in the time frame without React Native. The shared code and reusability of this platform actually worked for us. I was quite skeptical. I've used Xamarin in the past, and it requires a little bit of fiddling to actually achieve this, but it worked quite well. I was quite surprised. Just because there's a common language to work in doesn't mean everyone in the team should. So while we say we want a cross-functional team and people to move around, we don't want them just to jump onto something because they can. That caused a lot of friction for us. And also, it has a cost. So because it's abstracted away from native, one of the biggest bits of feedback I've heard about React Native is because you're working at an abstraction and that whole React Native platform has its own side effects and idioms and whatnot, sometimes it's just quicker to build it as native. It really depends on what your goals are. For us, it was the ability to integrate the mobile development sort of developers in our team with the greater development team, allow code reviews to happen and a little bit more collaboration. Hopefully down the road, a bit more code sharing between the main website and the app. And finally, mentioned this, throwing a team at a deadline is always a bad idea. Reading like the Mythical Man Month and similar books, we should know that throwing people at a problem, always a terrible idea, and reinforce that for me firsthand. We ended up launching and it was fine, but it severely hurt the happiness of our mobile developer, and we could have done that a lot better. One interesting thing that I think came out of it was because in React Native, all of your styling is done in JavaScript. We had a number of developers who were not very interested in visual styling. Because it suddenly was in JavaScript, it was still doing styling work, but it felt slightly different. So we got a lot more engagement with around the visual side of our applications from people who previously didn't really care about it. So this leads me to our choice to move to CSS-in-JS. Has anyone heard of this recently in the web space? So it's a reasonably new idea, but essentially we have multiple ways of doing styling on the web. We can do inline styles directly on elements, or we can write CSS where we declare classes and then on our HTML elements we can reference those classes, and then we can use CSS as sort of cascade to style our entire application. CSS-in-JS is still writing CSS, but you write it inside JavaScript. It then projects it to CSS. So in React land, the way this happens with Glamorous and Glamour is we create styled React components, which when they're rendered, inserts the appropriate CSS classes into a style tag that's managed by Glamorous. So you get all of the benefits of CSS, but it moves a lot of the problems. For us, we wanted to play around with it. Because we had theming, we needed to have a component library that supported multiple different products. It was a problem we needed to solve. We also wanted to reduce the amount of CSS we were sending to the browser. So because when we do server-side rendering of our React application, we know exactly what components are rendered for a particular request. Because Glamorous is tied to React's lifecycle, it knows exactly what styles are required for that page. So we can send just the CSS that's required for that page rather than a giant style sheet that has the styles for everything. So it enabled a bunch of technical things, but by far the most interesting thing was around the impact to the team. So for me, previous to this, whenever I was trying to figure out how to do styling, I'd be like, what do we use? Okay, let's just use Bootstrap because it solves all of these problems for me. And this is one of the main sort of approaches I see most people taking with styling, unless you come from sort of a design and that sort of viewpoint. Web developers who are not visual tend to treat CSS like something that's this black box that's super annoying. And that certainly was me. When we switched to Glamorous, which looks something like this, you go glamorous.nav, so that is a nav HTML element, and then you pass it a JavaScript object, which is all of the styles. This is still CSS, but you can kind of reference JavaScript variables in it. You can tie it to React's lifecycle and make it data-driven. You can do a bunch of other things with it. When we switched to this, we saw some really interesting dynamic shifts within the team. A bunch of people who just didn't touch styling at all started gravitating towards it. They're still writing CSS. Like, this is still CSS. It still ends up in the browser as CSS. All of the same concepts apply. You still need to understand CSS. The only difference is the language you're expressing it in. But there was a much greater shift than I would have expected. So the learnings from this one is CSS-in-JS increased engagement across our team for visual styling work. That was by far the most interesting side effect. Some of our team, because we were using TypeScript, they jumped in and wrote all of the TypeScript definitions for Glamorous and contributed that back to the community. Really some interesting side effects. Part of the conceptual alignment in terms of in the web space, you have CSS modules, which the idea is scope CSS classes to a particular component. There's a number of ways we can do this. If you're not using one of those, you've got these global styles which can be referenced in all of these different areas, but because you're building components, it's so easy to create a global CSS collision. I've got two types of buttons. I accidentally use a button class, which is defined in two places. It conflicts globally. I now have styling issues that are really hard to track down. Because we're building components, focusing on encapsulating these problems and not distributing styling problems across our design system and our products, we wanted to kind of conceptually align the way we work from a styling point of view with the way we work with a functionality point of view. Because CSS-in-JS, and specifically Glamorous, allows us to build components which have styles attached and scoped to that component, we now have aligned our functionality of our component library with the way we style. They work in the same way and they're conceptually linked. That's been really, really awesome. We've found that we no longer have styles that override other styles in products, causing all these maintainability issues. It's really just helped us move a lot faster and increase the confidence. What's been another benefit with visual regression testing, which I was talking about earlier, is as we've been able to move from SAS to CSS-in-JS, like refactoring the entire way we do it, we can make sure we haven't regressed anything in any of these components because we convert it all over. If there's any mistakes, the visual snapshots don't match. Pretty cool. And finally, CSS is treated as a concept, not a language. So we actually are thinking about styling and the way CSS works in the browser rather than the language we write it in. That's been pretty interesting. The final decision that I wanted to talk about, which is hasn't really come to fruition yet, we're still working on it, is the shift to continuous deployment. This for me is pretty interesting because we were using Scrum. That's the way we delivered the first couple of products. And coming from a consulting world, I've helped build Agile teams for different companies, and I kind of thought, well, Scrum is kind of the easiest Agile methodology for a team to sort of start with, mainly because it doesn't require as much discipline as other methodologies like Kanban. So I kind of thought, well, in any organization, if you follow Scrum and you're pragmatic and make sure that you follow the sort of Agile tenets, then Scrum should be able to succeed. There's a few things that have solidified in my mind around Scrum in particular. And this is the reasoning you would go for it. Scrum for me is all about predictability of a team. So how creating sustainable pace and a rhythm that you're working in fortnightly time boxes and the team commits to some sort of work in that time and then they meet that commitment. I talked earlier about being a news organisation where they're just thinking maybe 24 hours in advance. Scrum hurt us because we didn't actually care about predictability. We've got a huge list of things we want to do, and we don't really care about measuring and planning out everything. We just want to be working on the most important thing at any time. So a lot of the value that Scrum brings an organisation and a team were things that we really didn't want or need. This caused a lot of conflicts because we often would change sprint scope because, well, we didn't really care about the commitment so much. We cared about, oh, well, we have to react to this like change in the business because there's a new story come in or advertising, there's a event coming up, they want to book the site in 2 weeks, like things like that. The realities of the business is our 2-week time box was actually hurting our ability to succeed for the business. Our goal was to replace all of this in a certain time. So we moved across to Kanban recently. Does anyone know the origins of Kanban and what this is? It is, yeah, so Toyota production line. Kanban is a Japanese word and it stands for signal card. And the way it works is Kanban moves from kind of a push flow to a pull flow. So the way it would work is if you're on a particular station and you need a part, you create a Kanban, which is kind of like a work order, and then you give it to the team down the line that needs to give you something. You do it on demand when you're going to need it, and then they fulfill that order and return the Kanban to you with whatever you've kind of requested. It becomes this pull model. And it focuses on all of the things that we cared about, which was making sure that when we start a piece of work, we get it into production as fast as possible. There was no value for us waiting until we had a shippable increment. We wanted to just do the work, complete it, and get it into production. So Kanban was actually a really interesting switch because as soon as we made the move, a lot of the friction we felt with Scrum kind of just went away because we'd aligned our Agile processes to our goals. This introduced an interesting problem where we work using Git. We then have a pull request that has a piece of work, and then we merge it in. Is that done? Probably not. Like, as programmers, our job is to deliver value to the business. By just merging it to master, you've done nothing. Like, until that feature is in production, we haven't actually delivered any value. So what we are trying to do is move the problem of our code is here, now someone has to release it to production, not my problem, to, well, I want to make sure it's done at this point. We want all of our verification of our code to be done before it's merged to mainline. So really focus on this idea of mainline development. And once it is merged, it goes to production. You don't have to worry about manually getting sign-off from someone in the business because that's a problem of making sure that you have a shared understanding at the beginning of your process. Making sure that if you're going to build something for the business, you should understand the reasons why. And then if you get to the point that you've merged it and you've built the wrong thing, it becomes a conversation about how did we miss the shared understanding at the beginning. So trying to move a lot of these problems that often occur after the code is merged, move it away from the code, make it a decision that's happening much, much earlier in the process so we can move faster and actually get stuff done. Continuous deployment for me is less about the mechanics of deploying things and more about Well, I can build stuff, have confidence that it is complete and working and going to give business value, ship it, it ends up in production. I can get feedback on that almost immediately while it's still fresh in my mind, and then I can start working on the next thing. Focus on things moving through and flow. It also removes this fear of releasing to production. It's something that if the longer code has been sitting, waiting to be released, the more anxiety and fear that builds up about actually releasing that code. When you hit merge, you're like, yep, super cool, happy for this to go to production. And then just by it sitting there, all these worries and doubts actually come in. Let's remove that problem. It's not for everyone. Like, you don't want to be doing continuous deployment if it's going to go out, and if you've made a mistake, people die. That's really not responsible. But at the end of the day, we're building a news site. As long as we can focus on recovering quickly and reducing the types and impact of the problems we're introducing, it's heaps of benefits for us. So my main learnings. Talking about that merging, when things are busy, it's really hard to finish things, like really finish them. It's kind of that 90%. We found a lot of stories kind of ended up, we're kind of waiting for the product owner to sign this off or it's blocked. Because you're just focusing on writing code. Writing code's easy. Actually finishing it, making sure that everyone's happy, capturing the next steps, that's hard. It requires a contextual shift. When things are really busy, it's really hard to make that shift. When you feel the pain, like we persisted with Scrum for a very long time. It was painful, and we constantly were missing our sprint commitments because we were overcommitting and changing our sprint commitments, which meant our commitments meant less. We were more focused on making sure each story was getting done and not that we would meet the entire sprint commitment. We should have seen those signals a lot earlier and acted on them. So if things are painful, get the development team together, or the greater development team together, and figure out how you can make it better. Because often the whole idea of Agile is inspect and adapt. We did very little adapting. Well, we did, but it was not at a process level. We kind of should have been asking bigger questions, not just how can we fix this particular small problem? Look a bit more holistically. And accountability within the team is hugely powerful. So moving towards the idea that if you merge that pull request, it's going to production, you as a developer become a lot more accountable for the quality of what you're dropping onto the main line. This is hugely motivating as a developer because we have a blameless post-mortem process, so if we do introduce problems into production, it's the whole team's problem, not that person's fault. But having that support with the ability to have confidence that what you've done is ready to go to production is hugely empowering and very satisfying. I've got 2 honourable mentions of other impactful decisions we made that I won't have time to talk about. There was a originating decision where we thought, well, because all of that state is stored in another system and we're just kind of projecting it and serving up a bunch of data, an Elasticsearch index kind of feels right for storing all of our site data. That was, in retrospect, not the greatest decision because an index has to be rebuilt from scratch. You can't do database migrations and all of those sort of things. So about 3 weeks before launch, we ripped out our entire data store and replaced it with Postgres. You can imagine the kind of churn and stress that impacts for the team, but that was quite an interesting story. Feel free to come grab me throughout the conference. We also switched to TypeScript. That was hugely impactful because while converting a code base to TypeScript, you're constantly having merge problems. You have a new language for the team to learn. that had a lot more impacts to the team and the happiness in the short term than I thought it would have. It ended up being a great choice because static type checking across a large code base, great. But that was another one that actually hurt us a fair, like in the short term. So there's a couple of key takeaways. Make decisions, make them deliberate. Don't allow yourself to just have a non-decision because it's easier. Like if you're going to take a decision, actually record it, make it a deliberate choice, because then you can deliberately choose to change it later. Don't just leave it as kind of a default choice, so to speak, because non-decisions often hurt. We delayed a number of things because we weren't really sure. Often just making a decision means that you can measure and take, like in your retrospectives, see if the decision was a good one. Highly encourage you to make the decisions, and because it allows you to then review them over time. Also, I've given you a bunch of different technology-related decisions, but I've barely talked about the technology themselves, because most of the time the impacts is far greater than the technology itself. It impacts the team's happiness and their ability to be motivated and do good work. So Dan Pink has a great book, Drive. Highly recommend it because it's on a team on motivation. And people will make you succeed, not the technology choices. So a good team will help, will make anything work. So that was the power and consequences of technical decisions. I hope there's a few things to think about. I'm going to be around all week, and do I have time for questions? Not really. That's cool. Come grab me after. Thanks, everyone.